The Reading and Northern was founded in 1983 as the Blue Mountain and Reading Railroad, operating a 13-mile branch line between Hamburg and Temple, Pennsylvania, and in the following years would come to operate 3 more state-owned lines. In 1990, Conrail was looking to shed 150 miles of trackage in the Reading area, and the Blue Mountain and Reading purchased the cluster of lines, providing connection with what would prove to be a valuable commodity, anthracite coal. It was also at this time that the company would change their name to the current Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern Railroad. In 1992, Conrail was once again putting lines up for sale, this time around Hazleton, Pennsylvania, in the Jeddo Coal Company, allowing for the Reading and Northern to become the sole service provider for the anthracite region. Due to this fast expansion, the railroad would begin purchasing their own fleet of railcars, today owning over 1,800. In 1996, Conrail was knocking on the door again, wanting to sell a portion of their Lehigh Division between Jim Thorpe and Wilkes-Barre. The Reading and Northern would go through with the purchase, connecting the Reading Division with the new Lehigh Division. The railroad would begin leasing the Carbon County-owned rail line between Hometown and Jim Thorpe, linking the two divisions. The Carbon County-owned line was purchased outright by the railroad in 2021. With the split of Conrail in 1998 between Norfolk Southern and CSX, NS would become the sole interchange partner for the Reading and Northern. And with Conrail now gone, so too was the vast shedding of lines in the area. The Reading and Northern has seen a dramatic rise in carloads across their system, providing excellent service to businesses across the region under the helm of Andy Moeller, who has been guiding the railroad since its inception back in 1983. The Reading and Northern is headquartered in Port Clinton, so what do you say we go ahead and check it out? The current paint scheme for locomotives is an adaptation of the Reading Railroad's green and yellow paint scheme. GP39RN number 2535 wears an older red and yellow paint scheme from the early 2000s. The Reading and Northern uses only EMDs, from end-cab switchers such as 802 and 1542 to big SC50 locomotives, which are common on the railroad's fast freights, which operate on a tight schedule to ensure customers get their cars on time. The railroad also runs excursions with steam locomotives numbered 2102 and 405, along with diesel excursions powered by the former Norfolk Southern F units and other freight locomotives, and even Bud RDCs. At 0925, train OSJT rounds the curve into the Port Clinton station, making its usual weekend run between Reading Outer Station and Jim Thorpe. With OSJT on their way to Jim Thorpe, let's move down to Tuckerton, where the railroad has their North Reading Yard. Here we see YJNR, the North Reading Yard job, switching out cars for today's North Reading fast freight. The conductor on today's yard job was very helpful, giving insight into when the train would be departing and the rough schedule the train would follow. With an end-of-train device hanging on the rear, today's NRFF has almost been assembled, with just a few more cars to tack onto the head end. One of the more interesting operations you may see in a rail yard is called kicking cars, where the crew shoves back before uncoupling one or a few cars away from the train and hitting the brakes hard. The uncoupled rail cars then roll on their own into the correct track, assuming the conductor has lined them the correct way. If you are passing by, it may seem as though there's a runaway car in the yard, but it is all carefully coordinated to save the crew just a few moments of time. With the rest of the cars kicked onto the correct tracks, and train NRFF fully assembled, the yard crew leaves behind SD40-2 number 3056, who will not be making the trip north on the fast freight. Today's power is SD40-2, number 3064, in fresh green and yellow paint, and 3 SD50-2s, 5019, 5018, and 5020, all in the new Fast Freight paint scheme. With dark thunderstorm clouds rolling in and a 2 o'clock departure set out of North Reading, I had enough time to head over to the Norfolk Southern Reading line, arriving at Temple Station just in time for Train 30A. Unfortunately, the rain had arrived as well. At 1354, Train 28X hauls hot intermodal east on its final stretch towards Croxton. With 1400 rolling around, it was time to head for Mohrsville, Pennsylvania, a few miles up the tracks from North Reading. Luckily, the rain had cleared just in time for NRFF to head north, splitting the classic tri-light signals. With the head end by, it was also time for us to head north to Miller's Crossing as the train passes through rural Pennsylvania. I would barely beat the train to Hecla as they roll over Schuylkill Road. At Barnesville, the train turns west into the afternoon sunlight as it assaults the hometown grade. At Jim Thorpe, the Reading and Northern runs through the Lehigh Gorge State Park. Returning back to the Jim Thorpe station is the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railroad with GP 38-2 number 2013 serving as the power. Minutes later, and the NRFF is now cruising down grade as it crosses the new Jim Thorpe Bridge, which provides a direct link between the Reading and Lehigh divisions. Before the bridge construction was completed in 2020, the North Reading Fast Freight would have had to run into Jim Thorpe and run around their train before continuing north, adding valuable time to the train's trip. I wouldn't be able to get ahead of them again until Mountaintop, where the Reading and Northern has their Penobscot yard. It's here where Reading and Northern stores locomotives, like F7A's 250 and 251 awaiting an uncertain future, former Union Pacific SD50's 5022 and 5033, which has been placed out of service and likely are up for sale, along with 5 new to the RBMN SD40-2s that have been purchased from, you guessed it, Norfolk Southern. The SD40-2s are being overhauled as traffic demands and placed into service. One of these new to the RBMN ST40s is 3064, trailing fourth on today's NRFF, which has finished ascending the grade out of Lehigh Gorge as they pass by the deadline. "40 minutes later, and the NRFF is arriving into Pittston, where the train will swap inbound and outbound cars. Pittston is the northernmost major terminal on the Reading and Northern, and is a hub for activity. Here we see an old former Union Pacific SD-50 switching the yard. At the same time, JTPI, a Jim Thorpe to Pittston excursion train, arrives into the Pittston station. The sole leader is GP38-2, number 2023, honoring RBMN's 40th anniversary. Pittston is full of cool old antiques, like these wig-lag crossing signals and old railroad crossing signs. Let's watch as the YJPI-2 switches Pittston Yard. With YJPI-2 in the clear, the Pittston excursion pulls west from the station to reverse its train onto the Y. While the JTPI shoves onto the Y, NRFF begins doubling their train out of the yard. NRFF isn't due out of the yard until 1900, so the crew will leave the train here and headed to the yard office until then. While While we wait for the departure of NRFF, let's watch some more switching action. Here we see JTPI-2 now facing back east, while the YJPI gets busy breaking down the inbound NRFF cut. JTPI is done for the day and will tie their train down in the storage track for next weekend's excursions. I wouldn't stick around to see the NRFF depart Pittston. Instead, I would head to Duryea, where I hope to catch some sunlight on the nose. From there, it was back up to Mountaintop and to the Penobscot Tower at last light, where the NRFF begins their descent to Jim Thorpe. This is by far my favorite shot of the evening. With that, it was time to say goodbye to the NRFF and head back into Scranton to spend the night. Tomorrow, it's time to chase the Delaware and Lackawanna. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you next weekend for some rail fanning on the Metropolitan Subdivision. Until next time, this is Commonwealth Rail, out.